Welcome to the Carter Center's Forum on Human Rights. My name is Josh Griffin, and I'll be moderating today's conversation on racial justice and white nationalism. Please note, this roundtable will show videos of violence and language that some may consider offensive, as these were conscious decisions by the artists to convey their messages. However, we recognize that this may trigger uncomfortability for our viewers, and we wanted to highlight this potential in advance so you can make an informed decision. I'm a biracial Black man. My ancestors were slaves who lived under the brutality of white supremacy. My father was born in Hampton, Virginia in 1947 and grew up in the Jim Crow South. He was born 18 years before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The nursery rhymes he was told as a child were centered around Black death. As an adolescent, his grandmother taught him the importance of not whistling at a white woman because she didn't want him to end up like Clinton Johnson. You see, Clinton made that mistake. The police took him to the station and beat him to death. My father and his siblings would huddle around his grandmother as she would tell them the stories of the lynchings in North Carolina. How the Klan would tie ropes around ankles of Black bodies and parade their corpses down streets. I sit before you with historical trauma. The brutality of white supremacy, white nationalism is in my DNA. A lot has changed since 1947. There's a quote that reads, "The more things change, the more they stay the same." My hope is for our society not to stay the same, for it to change, for us to lean into challenging conversations with individuals whose identities and values differ from our own. In this place of difference, we will find collective growth. Joining me today in conversation is Dia Khan and Arno Michaelis. Can you both introduce yourselves and let our audience know what brings you to this conversation?
It's a pleasure to be here. Arno, would you want to go first?
Oh, thank you, Dia. Thank you, Josh, and thanks to everybody at the Carter Center who made this happen. My name is Arno Michaelis. I am a storyteller. I tell stories primarily in the form of speaking engagements, but also as an author and a filmmaker. And my storytelling is done with the intention of helping people see themselves in others and see others in themselves. It's informed and driven by my past as a white nationalist from 1987 to 1994. And my personal mission statement and the intention of my work is to help bring about a world where all people are valued and included.
Again, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the Carter Center. Thank you, Arno. I am a documentary filmmaker. My background is actually of a human rights activist who then turned into a filmmaker out of frustration in terms of what kind of stories, not just what kind of stories were being told in our public space, but the way some of the stories that we tell about each other and about ourselves, how intentionally or unintentionally they can become quite dehumanizing and not allow us to get closer to why we sometimes do the things that we do, why our lives take the paths that they do, and what we might be able to do that would change the course of somebody's life. I'm the daughter of Muslim immigrants from Norway. I have lived and worked in the UK for several decades now. I grew up between differences. So differences is something that has very much impacted my life, impacted my artistic work, the way that I engage in the world, the way that I found myself rejected from the society that I grew up in. And actually, much like Arno, the reason I started making films was to see if I can tell stories and create moments where little windows might open up, where we might recognize ourselves in somebody else, where we might remember and recognize our own humanity in somebody else. And the reason I think that's so important is maybe in that gesture, some of the differences and the divisions and the hatreds and the fears might evaporate. So it's such a pleasure to be here.
I'm honored to be able to be in conversation with you both and learn from you all, during this time that we have together. And I also want to encourage our audience to, feel free to ask questions to our guests today. drop your questions down in the live chat function, and we'll definitely be able to get those asked. I want to start out by asking you all, like, what is white nationalism? What does it feel like? What does it look like? How has that impacted your lives and your existence and how you experience the world? Arno, what are your thoughts?
Well, for me, white nationalism was the lowest part of my life. It was when I was at my worst. I'm 51 now. I'll be 52 in a month or so. And the 7 years I spent as a white nationalist from 1987 to 1994 were far and away the most miserable years that I've spent. And that misery was really rooted in the harm that I've done to other people. That harm stays with me to this day, and I shudder to think of those who are still experiencing trauma from things that I've done back then. And that's a big driver to my work, is to hopefully divert other people on the path to white nationalism or who are involved in it to a better place for them and for the world. And at the same time, since I've been doing this work in the counterviolent extremism space for the past going on 13 years, I understand white nationalism from a broader scope and from the historical scope of white supremacy, which created the idea of race and then used that concept, the ideology of race, as the foundational oppressive structure upon which all oppressive structures are built. So again, that's a target of my work, is to not only reach people on an individual level with a message of hope and of redemption and personal responsibility, but also to talk about the historical horror that race has imposed upon humanity for 400 years, and particularly people with higher amounts of melanin in their skin. And I think we need to bear witness to that suffering as a society before we have any chance of moving to a better place.
I like that. Dia, what are your thoughts?
Well, I resonate very much with what Arno said. And going back to your question about what does white nationalism mean to me? So being a little brown child growing up in Oslo, Norway, I grew up afraid of guys like Arno. I used to, my family had, and their friends were attacked by white supremacists and neo-Nazis in particular in Norway at the time. I remember as a 13, 14-year-old starting to go to some of the anti-fascist protests, shouted at them, screamed at them, threw stuff at them, flipped them off, did all the sort of usual stuff. And I remember my dad always saying that, look, you have to have some patience. You just have to wait it out. You just have to give it some more time. With time, this infection of racism will eventually lessen, and people will find a way to understand each other better, and you won't have to feel what you feel now, and you won't have to fight the fights that you fight now. And the sad reality is, which refers to the your quote earlier as well, is that things don't change, and things don't change by themselves. So it requires people on all sides of this to actively participate in that change. Nobody, I think discrimination and inequality and oppression doesn't uproot itself. It has no interest in uprooting itself. So it requires real effort, and efforts of multiple forms, obviously. So to meet somebody like Arno later in life has been eye-opening, has been incredible for me to see that someone can be this way at one point in their life and can be somebody that my brother would have hid from. And his friend got stabbed by people like Arno, who can today sit here and, having done the work that he's done and speak the kind of truth that he's now able to speak, is just extraordinary. It restores my belief in human beings' capacity to transform.
Absolutely. How do we get people actively engaged, right? How do we get people to be like yourselves, engaged in fighting and resisting white nationalism?
I think what's really important, and I think what's sadly missing from a lot of the dialogue around white nationalism today is we need to shelve our political frame of reference on this. And I understand to a lot of people, they see life itself as a political process. Like, it's a very popular saying, like, my life is politicized. And I have to respect that. And I don't diminish anyone's feelings in that regard. But what it boils down to when you're trying to have a dialogue is this concept or this approach where, like, until this person submits to my subjective political opinions, I haven't made any progress. And the bottom line is everybody's not gonna submit to everybody else's subjective political opinions. That's just not how human beings work. So I think in order to connect with someone across a political divide, we need to shelve politics and connect as individuals and listen to stories of firsthand experience. And that's one of my go-to techniques if I'm working in an intervention scenario with somebody who's involved in a white nationalist group. They're going to start out with all sorts of macro issues and, the southern border of the United States and, Israel, Jews, blah, 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 like about all sorts of things happening in the world. But I want to know about their personal experience. So I'm going to say, well, what happened to you that makes these things important to you? What happened to you that makes these things resonate with you? And then once you got somebody talking about their firsthand personal experiences, you're essentially doing therapy with them. You're trying to pinpoint the trauma that all this animosity stems from. And in my experience, that's the best way to address it, rather than button heads on a political issue and expecting your opponent to submit to you.
Absolutely. And Dia, would you say film is another mechanism that can be used?
Well, I think art in general is a mechanism. I think, what I have found, having worked not just filming white supremacists, but also filming extremists of other brands, basically, is that, extremism thrives on and is born from emotions. It's not logical, right? So if we are to engage with that, then for us to, like, I can try to outfact you, I can try to bring all kinds of statistics and historical facts and figures, and it means nothing to most of these guys. So I think the place where art is so powerful is at the point of emotional connection. Art is the language of the heart. It hits you here first. And once you can feel something, then maybe you can think differently. But I think, and also going to what Arno was saying, my experience pretty much 100% of the time has been that the way to do this, the way to set the table for this, is to find the humanness in the other, whoever the other is. And that gesture is not going to come from a white supremacist. That gesture is not going to come from, if people have issues with, Trump fans or whatever, it's not going to usually come from that side. So I think that gesture has to be made by somebody else. And I think, one of the barriers to really unpicking this and getting to a different outcome is that we're too busy being right. We really are. I mean, we're just obsessed with being right rather than doing the right thing. It's more important for us to get patted on the back from all of our friends for having all the, Arno, like you were saying, for having all the correct politics, for having all the correct views, for having all the correct friends, and having all the correct rhetoric. But the thing is, we have to act out of our values. We have to behave from our values, and we have to act on those when they are challenged and when the other person we feel doesn't deserve compassion, doesn't deserve empathy, doesn't deserve human rights, doesn't deserve dignity or equality within any of that. And the risk of, I think, approaching these issues in that sense is we become that which we are fighting against. And I refuse to do that. One of the reasons I finally decided, as I said earlier, I was afraid. I spent a huge part of my life being afraid of guys like this, afraid of people like that, afraid of this, afraid of that. And it just, first of all, life is too short to be scared. the whole time. So I had to make a conscious decision that either you continue being scared of this, or you do something, or you continue being angry at them and shouting at them, flipping them off, even getting close to punching them, which all feels really good. I'm not going to lie; it feels very good to feel self-righteous and to be right. It feels great, but it doesn't resolve anything. And I, of all people, should know what it feels like to be dehumanized. I should know that. I know that. So I refuse to be afraid, because that's what these movements need. They need us to be afraid. They need us to become like them. They need us to become hateful. And secondly, I refuse to dehumanize somebody else, because I know what it feels like. And I refuse to do it, even to people who dehumanize me. I refuse to. Even though I would be justified in doing it, nobody would complain. They'd clap for me if I went, honor you, honor that. But that's not how we live out of the values that we claim to believe in. If we are only willing to extend our values to people that we like, people who we agree with, people who are like us, what's the difference? Really, that's what the Nazis are doing. So somebody has to go first. And usually it is people who have had something done to them, populations who have been oppressed, that take that first step. But I'm not saying it's the responsibility of oppressed people. So I'm not saying that's a burden that people who've been victimized should carry. But some of us do want to do that.
Yeah, I think that's deeply important, right? You got to find ways to channel this energy into to bring people into that conversation, these challenging conversations. And I know when you're with your documentary, White Right Meeting the Enemy, you did this. You actively went and you sought out individuals who didn't necessarily agree with who you are and what you stand for.
They wanted me dead. I mean, most of them. I mean, the way it started was, I did an interview on the BBC talking about the multicultural Britain, and one of the phrases I said is that Britain will never be white again. And that unleashed wrath like I have never seen. And I'm used to living with death threats. I've had death threats most of my life. And this was so intense, and it was so vicious, and it was so focused. I mean, I found this out later, but several violent racist websites in America, some who were frequented by Dylan Roof and many others in this country, were being actively directed to basically go scare the life out of this woman, like go get her, basically. And I remember that some of the security people at the BBC even called, and they were like, "Look, what we're getting for you is very, very dark. You need to take this seriously." And at the time, I was editing a different film, and I was in London. And the police called me because the BBC had called them, and they said, "You need to get away from windows right now. You need to make sure if there are windows in the room you're in, you need to leave. You need to get somewhere else." So I did. The police came, they talked to me, and that night, I remember that was when I made the decision. When I thought, they want me to be scared. What is the purpose of these death threats? They want me to be afraid. They want me to change my behavior. They want me to go hide, and they want me to be silent. And so now I have to decide, do I do that, or do I do what is the most uncomfortable and most difficult thing for me to do, which is seek them out and see if it's possible for us to sit with each other. And is it possible for him to see my humanity? And is it possible for me to see his? Because it's not like I love these guys, right? So is that possible? Can we sit down and have a conversation?
What's really interesting, Dan, I remember the comment you made on BBC, and I love it. And you're not mentioning the whole comment, because what you said was people have to get through their head that Britain is never going to be white again.
Yes.
But then you also said people coming to the UK from Bangladesh and from Pakistan have to understand that they are coming to a secular democratic society that is not run by the theocracy that they're used to. And that that's what I love so much about your work, is that you were absolutely addressing like both sides of an issue.
I thought it was very even-handed. It was
I thought so as well. It absolutely was. But of course, people just cherry pick, and they're like, "Oh, I could have found common ground on the first thing she said, but I'm just going to fixate on the second thing." That threatens this card house ideology I built around my identity.
For sure.
Exactly.
Speaking of that, we have a clip that speaks to what inspired that. So I want to play that clip real fast. That is encapsulates what you're describing right now. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what Dee is speaking to and how that inspired her to create the documentary White Right Meeting the Enemy.
In the summer of 2016, the BBC interviewed me about living in a multicultural society.
The fact of the matter is, the UK is never going to be white again. Similarly, our parents who have left Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Muslim countries, for them to think that they can re-establish those countries and the lives that they had there over here, it's not going to happen. We're together going to have to find out, what does it mean to build a society that includes all of us?
To my shock, this interview went viral, and I received a deluge of hate emails from people across Europe and America. But I've decided not to hide. I've decided to try to meet the kind of people who sent me this abuse. I want to try to get behind the hatred and the extremist ideology, to find out what they are really like as human beings.
So what'd you find out? What'd you find out who they are as human beings once you got behind that hate?
I found a surprising amount of trauma. I found a lot of disenfranchised people. I found a lot of very angry guys in particular. There are obviously women in the movement as well. I found a lot of broken people. I found a lot of people without much hope for a different future for themselves. And all of this, it's very hard for all of us as human beings to look at ourselves and to deal with our own stuff and to accept the fact that maybe some of what's going on in my life is my own doing, or is my parents' doing, or other suffering and pain that we have. It's far easier to take all of that discomfort and all of that trauma and pain and go, I need to put this on something else so that I don't have to fully feel it. And the way you do that is you find scapegoats, whether it's women, whether it's people of color, whether it's people of other gender and sexual identities, whoever your target becomes, or it can be your own wife and your own children in some cases. So I found that, but what I also found was surprisingly, once we started, like once the chest beating and the stuff that was supposed to put me off, once I sat through that and I didn't budge, which was very hard for me, and I didn't kind of lash back out at them, and I just sat there and just waited for them to sort of finish emptying out all the stuff, all the talking points. Once we actually were able to connect and get to some of the humanness of it all, it was really interesting to see that obviously their hopes, their fears, their longings, their desires and wishes for their lives and their kids, is no different than mine, obviously. And none of this is, rocket science. We can all sort of guess this, but to see it in front of your eyes and to also see that there are tiny openings where something else can be possible for this person was really important. And what I also learned is I learned a lot about, one guy ended up leaving the movement while I was still making the film. During the edit, he called me and he's like, look, I need to tell you something. And he said, look, I can't reconcile this. I've been in this movement a really long time, and I've come to consider you a friend, and the way that you were treated was just not okay. So I'm leaving, basically. And then 2 months after that, another young man who's got like massive swastikas tattooed on his chest, and he was quite a handful. And he tormented Muslims for a very, very long time in Jewish communities and other communities. He decided to leave. And just a couple of years after the film, one of the leaders of the largest neo-Nazi organizations called me. And he said, look, I can't do this anymore. And he said, and I have nowhere to go. I have no friends. I have no community. I have nothing outside of this movement. So you're one of the only people I can talk to. What do I do? So that I never expected. Never, never, never in a million years would I, if you said to me a few years before making the film, you're going to become friends with people like this, I would have been offended.
Yeah.
You would think that I could be friends with people like that, but that's what's ended up happening. And so I learned that change is possible, not for everybody, but that capacity does exists there. And if you give people something else, something more creative or productive or healthy to do with all that stuff that we all carry with us, it can go a different way. And I also learned a lot about myself. You know, they changed, but I changed as a result of making the film too. I recognized how I'm very quick to dehumanize other people too.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And that's not okay. Just because I feel like that doesn't make it okay.
Absolutely.
And not okay when he does it.
For sure. I hear it sounds like you leaned into the discomfort, and in that discomfort, you found a place of understanding that while this person has extreme beliefs, we're still people. We're still part of this human experience, and there is common ground, right? We live in a
There
very
always is.
Yeah,
There always is, but it's buried sometimes so deep. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of patience to find it and to look. But I'm always, in every film I make, I'm always looking, where is the crack? There will inevitably always be a crack in the facade, whatever the facade is meant to be.
Arnold, what
in
was
that crack?
Absolutely, Arnold. I'd love to hear about the crack, that Dia is speaking to, that brought you out of the movement, right? What was that crack for you? How is that the love and compassion? How did that assist you to do what you currently are doing?
Well, I absolutely agree with Dia that crack is always there. I'm a Buddhist nowadays, and we call it basic goodness. It's just the belief that all human beings are worthy of compassion, and that we're all capable of showing compassion, and that's a constant in this world where everything else is in constant motion. I think talking about white supremacy in a broader sense, like I don't know that it's really as understood as it needs to be by many people who decry it. I think we don't understand that the foundation of white supremacy is separatism. It's difference. It's other. And it's not necessarily the premise of white supremacy that white people are in charge. The premise is that there are white people, and then there's everybody else. So anytime we're trying to address white supremacy and coming from like playing by its rules that there's white people and everybody else, I think it really diminishes our chances for success. And going back to my story, that was how I oriented my life. Every waking moment of every day, I'm like, I'm white. I'm a white man, and everybody else is an enemy. And even people who are white but don't think like me are enemies. So I was in this mode where I practiced being intimidated by the world around me every waking moment of every day. And one of the hugest factors in my turnaround was very brave people like Dia, who had the courage to treat me with kindness when I least deserved it, but when I needed it most. And it's actually it's a technique in conflict resolution and other kind of spaces where you're trying to create dialogue. And it's called a non-complimentary response. So a complimentary response to my hostility would have been just reflecting that hostility. I had a swastika tattooed on my middle finger back then that's since been covered up with the V in Love Wins here. And the reason I had a swastika on my middle finger was because I wanted to shock people. I wanted to hurt them. I wanted to make them angry. And the complimentary response to my actions would have been to just come at me and scream at me, flip me off, like hit me in the face. Please be violent with me. That's what I was trying to provoke. The non-complimentary response would be to say, hey, that's not how I operate. That's not how I treat other human beings. I'm not going to dehumanize myself, no matter how much you try to dehumanize me, following Dia's lead. And so it was people like a Jewish boss, a lesbian supervisor, Afro-American and Latino coworkers who treated me with kindness when I least deserved it, but when I needed it most. And the impact of that kindness was to just shatter the ideology I had assumed as my identity, and to let me know in no uncertain terms that that ideology was false and that it didn't jibe with the real world. And once that crack had been breached, it was very difficult to put back together. And it ultimately led to me leaving in 1994.
It's an amazing story, amazing testimony. I resonate when you speak to, how you said that I am white. I very much have this belief of I am Black, and a lot of that is built out of my lived experiences and what my people have gone through. And I'm currently having my own, liberation journey of dismantling this belief and leaning into, this discomfort that you both have spoken to. I want to now show a trailer of Dia's film, White Right, Meeting the Enemy, so we can really see how everything that we've spoken to this point has shown up in this film, and how you can go out there and find something you're passionate about and turn that into a project that then can lead to social change. So here we go.
My hair okay? It's not flying around into any directions.
So as you know, I am a woman of color.
Yes.
Yes. I am the daughter of immigrants. I am a Muslim. I am a feminist. I am a lefty liberal.
I wouldn't have ever
see your
guessed.
face. And what I want to ask you is, am I your enemy?
You're not subjectively my enemy, but what you are promoting will lead to the disappearance of my people and my culture. And I will tell you this, it annoys me tremendously when I'm told by some immigrant or a child of immigrants that the only reason my country is worthwhile is because people like them have come here. It's as if to say, my ancestors built a dung heap, and I don't doubt your goodwill, but your goodwill is objectively going to lead to the oblivion of my people. I'm sorry, there is no other way to see it.
My name is Dia Khan. I'm an activist and filmmaker. When I was 6 years old, my father took me to my first rally against racism and fascism. I grew up in Norway, where white skinhead gangs terrorized our small Muslim community. My father told us things would change, but extremism and racism are on the rise again in Europe and America. I decided to meet people who think the white race is under threat, and that I am their enemy.
Fuck you! Get a heart attack, nigger!
I met neo-Nazis.
Jews and homosexuals, they should be exterminated, every single one of them.
History will decide who is superior.
Men who say they've lived lives of racist violence.
Nigger, prepare to burn. You've attacked our people, and now it's your turn. I've hurt people horrifically with my bare hands.
I've been to prison. I've kidnapped people. I've harmed people. I've done things that you would think I'm insane.
And I sat down with the new leaders of the white nationalist movement, men from privileged and elite backgrounds.
We did it. We took it. We took it with force. We won.
Shame! Shame on all of you! Shame!
I joined the extremists on the front lines of the race wars in America. I wanted to see if I could understand their anger, to get to know the personal reasons why they are drawn to such hatred and division.
Fuck you!
That's a lot to take in. A lot to take in, but I think that's the reality.
It is.
That's the reality. Like Childish Gambino has a really good music video called "This Is America," and that is America. This is America. So now what are we gonna do? Yeah. You can be like Arno, you can be like Dia, and you can lean into the discomfort. You can look within yourselves to find ways to change. But when we turn away from challenging conversations, we turn away from hearing really hard words, change doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Change doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So as you both rewatched that video, what came to mind? What memories? How did that make your body feel? When you sat there and you saw that and you heard what people were saying and thinking.
I get chills still. And obviously, I viscerally remember it happening in real time, and just how horrifying it was and how scared I was. And also, I remember walking at Charlottesville because I ended up there with them, filming them. And one of the things that I was walking behind one of these groups, and they were laughing and talking about how one of their fantasies is to give an abortion, basically cut a woman's stomach open, like a woman of color, so that more cockroaches aren't born. And what nobody knew at the time, including the TV channel and some of my own colleagues, was that I was pregnant at the time. And this was in the middle of the summer heat in Virginia, and I was wearing huge scarves, multiple layers, even like these semi kind of wool jackets, just to hide the fact that I was pregnant. And I just, yeah, it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. And I remember, like, the after Charlottesville ended up in this compound. And the reason I'm saying this is I'm under no illusion, just because I've said some of the things that I've said today, I'm under no illusion how dangerous this movement is. I'm under no illusion how deeply entrenched and how deadly this movement is. I remember after, but I do think that there are other ways we can do something about this, or there are more ways that we can try and do something about this. But I remember getting to this compound afterwards. One of the guys had told me that it's okay, you're allowed to film, it's fine. And we're at the top of this dirt road, and there's this compound down in the mountains of Virginia. And I grabbed my camera, and it's just myself and a colleague and one of the white supremacists, basically. And my colleague goes, "Don't pick up the camera, just leave it. Just we'll come back and pick it up if it's okay." I said, "No," he says, "It's fine. Let's just go. It's fine. It's okay. Let's just take it." And he's like, "No, let's not do that." So I have my phone in my hand, didn't take the camera. We walk down this dirt road, and not even halfway down, and these groups of guys start gathering. And they're from the fights from earlier, and some of them are topless and have the bruises on their arms. And some of them are carrying weapons that I've seen in news footage in battlefields. And they start screaming and shouting, saying, "Put your effing hands up. Put your effing hand, who the F are you?" And we slowly make it down, and the guy that was with us disappears. They separate me and my colleague. They start shouting at him there. They're shouting at me here. And one guy comes up to my face, like almost noses touching, and he blows smoke in my face. And he said, are you effing pregnant? And I said, "No, I am not." And I remember, and I glanced down at my phone and had no signal. And I remember thinking, this is how it ends. This is how they can put me in the ground. Nobody's going to find me. I hadn't even told my colleagues I was there, which is not a great thing to have done. And I just remember thinking, that's it. This is how it's going to go. And eventually one of the guys who'd come with us, he'd managed to negotiate with them to let us go. So we were able to leave. And I remember getting back to the motel that night and emailing my colleague back in England saying, "Look, if you don't hear from me every 2 days or so, here's my brother's phone number, here's my mother's phone number, and you make sure you let them know that it's not okay, that I'm not okay." So all of those feelings and memories, and I feel sort of chills even thinking and remembering it. So all of that comes back as I watch the clip.
Yeah, it's for me. Anytime I see this film, or I see this really visceral display of active white nationalists, I try to imagine what it would be like to be Dia in that situation, or what it would be like to be you, Josh, to be someone who has visceral historical trauma like rehashed every time this crosses a news screen. I can only imagine what that's like, but I do, and I work on it, and I try to help use that emotion to drive the work that I do. And the other thing that came to mind watching that clip is the truth that white nationalism always co-presents with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism and white nationalism are absolutely symbiotic entities. And I think it's important today that we honor the massacre that happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue 4 years ago today, in which 11 people were murdered, almost all of them senior citizens, by a white nationalist who who through this marriage of anti-Semitism and white nationalism, believed that it was the Jews who were bringing all these non-white people into the country to take it over, and that's what drove him to commit that atrocity. So I think it's very important to understand the symbiotic role that anti-Semitism has with white nationalism. And I also think that there's a lot of people on the progressive side of the spectrum that don't understand that and really need to, because when we look at Jews as from a perspective of the Israel-Palestine conflict and our passion about that conflict, I don't think people really know that the harm that can cause in real life to real people.
No, absolutely. I also want to share a quote, Arno, that I think really speaks to just collective action and the power of collective action. You once said, if we can cultivate a culture where healing is a practice and where compassion is a practice, kindness is a practice, that's going to make a society that's less conducive for hate speech to happen. And I long for that society to come about so that no more Tree of Life massacres happen, right? No more Charlottesville happen. No more shootings in South Carolina happen at churches. How do we go forward? How do we build this society? Dia, what are your thoughts?
I think we first have to inhabit and practice ourselves that which we are hoping to see in others. And I think, this is a huge challenge and a huge struggle that was there before us and will unfortunately probably still be there in some shape after our lifetime. But I think what we can do, so I think, it requires multiple different efforts. There's a systemic, obviously, a very clear systemic aspect of it. We have to chip away at that. We have to, I think, also address head on some of the foundations of inequality that exists, that creates experiences of people of color, but also the experiences of white working class or white poor people. So I think all those systems are really important to look at. But I also think that, extremism and radicalization and these types of violent movements also thrive on basic human needs not being met in people's lives. Things like belonging, aspects like, wanting to find something to do with your life, wanting to affect change, albeit in a negative way. And I think we have to do more in terms of being there for our younger people when they're going through the various convulsions in their lives before they get recruited into groups like this or into gangs or into, jihadi groups or whatever. And then I think it also comes down to this individual practice of how do we each show up to some of this? Do I choose to work on the systemic side of it and the social justice activism in that sense? Or do I want to practice every day with everyone that I come across that I always put their dignity at the forefront of how I treat them, regardless of who they are, what they deserve or don't deserve, but I choose to show up to life in that way. But I think, also we have to understand the kind of victimhood stories that these types of groups talk about. And we have to be careful, I think, not to play into that. And oftentimes when we deplatform and ban some of these people, what it tends to do it tends to have the opposite effect of what we're looking for. We're looking to shut it down and show them this is unacceptable. You got to take it somewhere else. It's not okay. And it seems to have the opposite effect where the infection actually gets deeper and spreads wider. And so that's something we've got to think about some of our approaches, not just in the sense of, am I right? And am I doing something that makes me feel good? Or am I doing something that will actually stop this? Going back to this thing about being right, as good as it feels to be self-righteous, I would much rather there be one less racist than me be right and me just speak to the choir, basically. So I think there are multiple ways of engaging with this, and we all have to choose what our sort of comfort zone is. And I want to reiterate that I do not believe for one second that it is the responsibility of oppressed people and victimized communities to have to reform their abuser. I absolutely do not believe in that. But I do think that the people that want to push ahead and confront some of these guys in various ways should have the space to do that. That should be one solution, one more solution on the table. It's not the only solution, but it's one more solution. That's a very productive one. Arno didn't change because we shouted him down. Arno didn't change because we kicked him in the face. Arno didn't change because we shamed and humiliated him. He changed because we tried to speak to his humanity. Somebody tried to appeal to the better in him. And at some point, the better in people does rise up.
Absolutely.
It does show up.
Absolutely.
So we have to expect more from these guys.
Yes. No,
Can I say one last thing before
Sure,
I forget it?
yeah.
I think there is one sort of unspoken aspect of this really important to put on the table, which is gender. Gender is very important in this conversation, which is we need to think about why so many of our school shooters are young white guys. Because we keep talking about the whiteness of this, which is very important, obviously, for all the reasons we've spoken about. But also the fact that it's a male is very, very important. The fact that this is male violence, the fact that most of the people that were at Charlottesville, 97%, I would say, were men. The people engaging in the fights and the brutality were men. All the shooters we've talked about today, whether it's at the synagogues or it's at the church or it's trying to blow up mosques, they are all men. So what is it about the maleness and the whiteness in that combination that is leaning towards this type of violence? What is it?
I think sadly, the maleness does just fine on its own, creating violence without the whiteness.
Yeah.
You made another film called Jihadi that didn't have a single white guy in it.
No.
And it's not that violent extremism is the exclusive domain of white men. I work with a brilliant group called Parents for Peace. People can find out more about that at parentsforpeace.org with the number 4. And the premise of Parents for Peace is that violent extremism is a public health issue that all people are susceptible to, and also all people are threatened by. And I think that, again, that holistic view of it is part of the tactic itself. Going back to the core of white supremacy being separation and disconnect, we have to defy those rules and say, like, hey, these are actually things that happen to all people, and have that holistic sense. And at the same time, I absolutely agree to the gender point. I've helped to organize a conference about a gendered response to violent extremism, and I've gone so far as to say that all violence breaks down to testosterone mismanagement. And I've had women push back on that harder than anybody else, saying, well, women do horrible things too, and women
of course they do.
Yeah.
And I say, yeah, they do, but anytime you find a woman being violent, you connect 2 dots back to some asshole guy that's driving the trauma behind it. And maybe that's my opinion on it. But I do think that there's absolutely an issue with what masculinity means in our society, and again, in a broader sense. Patriarchy was not a European invention. There's patriarchy throughout all human societies for the past 200,000 years, and for better and worse. There's a lot of great things about our society right now. I think the idea that, like, oh, patriarchy is this awful, horrible thing and everything wrong is its fault, it's very reductive, and it doesn't understand the complexity behind everything. At the same time, I want a society where all people are valued and included, and that there's a equal representation of genders throughout positions of power and throughout business and academics and activism. So that's something that's very important to me. But I totally agree that there's something wrong with the way that men operate. And I think that what's behind that is that, again, in so many societies around the world, men are forbidden to cry. Yeah. Men are forbidden to say that they're afraid, or that they're feeling vulnerable, or I'm afraid no one's going to like me. I'm
Yeah.
afraid no one's ever going to love me. Like, it's hard for any human being to say those things, but it's exponentially harder for a man who feels that he's not allowed to express those things. And what happens is you get a pressure cooker going.
Yeah.
And that pressure cooker can manifest itself in Charlottesville, as Tree of Life, as Emmanuel AME, or as domestic violence, as Dia's latest film portrays. So it's important to understand all those factors happening, and then I think it's all the more important to respond to that with compassion, rather than saying like, well, that's toxic masculinity and men are toxic and this is all rape culture and smash the patriarchy. And it amuses me actually when I see like really, and I consider myself a feminist, but I see a lot of other people who consider themselves feminists being like, rah, smash the patriarchy. And I'm like, okay, well, I like my feminism with a little less testosterone, please. Like, just let's be a little more feminine about it, actually. And I mean that in all seriousness, because it was gentle power that reached me and changed the course of my life. What Dia does in all of her films, and especially in White Right, is wield a gentle power that is absolutely devastating to violent extremist ideologies like white nationalism. You're not gonna like out hate white supremacy. You're not gonna like out aggro the patriarchy. It's just a bad tactic. So I think we need to be mindful of what our tactics are as we're engaging in this fight if we want to be successful.
Yeah.
No, I couldn't agree more. I noticed we keep talking about, Charlottesville, and I do want to play a clip from Charlottesville to remind us of, this is what America is. What you're going to see, it has a long history of violence. We live in a very violent country. We do violence well, in my opinion. This might be hard to watch, but this is America. So that's a little warning before I show this clip.
I don't know how many people are hurt, but there are people on the ground being treated by the medics. Were people running up the street screaming and crying. There's many people on the side injured too. It's a really horrific sound.
They just literally came down the street at 80 miles per hour to fucking hit us just now. There are people, bodies laying on the ground right now. We told city councils we did not want them here. They let them come. We told the police we did not want them here. They let them come. I had to duck out of the way or I almost got hit by the car my fucking self. I see bodies fired from getting hit by that car. I see people in blood on the fucking ground. This is my town. We did not want the motherfuckers here. And now we got bodies on the ground and they're trying to revive somebody right now.
This is hard to watch, hard to take in. One thing that really resonated with me was the last individual at the end who forcefully stated, "This is my town and we didn't want them here."
Yeah.
Right. This is our country. How do we all live here? We have 5 minutes left. I would love for you to tell our audience, how do we all live here? What do you hope they take away from this conversation?
What a theme that keeps coming up for me in this work is that suffering demands witness. It's just a fact of human life. If somebody's suffering, we're going to bear witness to it one way or another. Is it going to be through compassion, or is it going to be through aggression? And that's the thing. That's our choice. If we don't bear witness to suffering with compassion, as we haven't bear witness to the suffering that has happened to Afro-American people for 400 years, that you bear witness to that suffering through aggression. And that also applies on an individual basis for these guys involved in white nationalism. Their individual suffering is what makes the ideology appealing to them. And if we don't bear witness to that suffering with compassion, we're going to bear witness to it through their aggression. And so that needs to guide any sort of response that there is to white nationalist activity. I wrote a piece called How to Smash Neo-Nazi Events on my blog at mylifeafterhate.com. And it's entitled a little sensationally on purpose because it's not about smashing anything really. It's about organizing fundraisers for great causes and controlling the narrative rather than letting the neo-Nazis do it. As tragic as Charlottesville was, and it's heartbreaking that people lost their lives and they were injured that day. I can't imagine what it's like for that man to see that happening in his town, and I completely understand his anger. But the bottom line is that the way the Charlottesville rally was responded to was like how not to do it as far as the aggression goes. And Dia's familiar with this. She's done the flipping off and the screaming, and it doesn't. That's what the neo-Nazis want. Like, if you don't understand your opponent's objectives and you are unwittingly fulfilling those objectives for them, you're going to have a very hard time being successful in any sort of conflict. So understand that, and put it this way, when I was active in white nationalism, the anti-fascists at Milwaukee were very few in number, and they were very wimpy. Like, we couldn't even get our hands on them. They'd call the cops as soon as they saw us. So we would pile in the vans and drive 6 hours to Minneapolis, where there was a whole bunch of Antifa, and they were a lot tougher, and we knew we'd get a fight from them. That's why the Proud Boys all go to Portland, Oregon for their rallies, because Portland, Oregon is Antifa ground zero. That's why all these guys flock to Charlottesville with their motocross outfits and their shields and their helmets, is because they knew they were going to get a brawl from Antifa response. So it's vitally important to not play their game and to not let them dictate the rules of engagement. And that video is tragic evidence of what happens when we do let them dictate the rules of engagement.
Absolutely. Dia, I want to come to you before we wrap up.
I completely would like to echo what Arno said. One of the biggest lessons I've learned from doing this work is that what this movement needs from us is our fear. What it thrives on and will expand on is us becoming hateful like them. They need us to get better at dehumanizing other people. So I think what we need to do in order to resist it is to resist those impulses, to resist becoming hateful, resist becoming fearful, resist starting to dehumanize. And also a key factor is hope. They want us to feel hopeless. So I always say this, and this is just as true today as it was some years ago, hope in my view is resistance. Hope to me is an act of defiance. So hope is something we cannot afford to let go of. And I think Arno and I are living proof that even though this seems really big and it does feel hopeless, and the reality is this movement is growing and spreading really fast across the US, but also across the world, we have to hold on and practice what we say we believe. So we have to engage, and we have to hold on to compassion. And as soggy as it sounds, we have to work from a place of light and love. We have to. Otherwise, this gets darker. It will.
Yeah. And together, we can do that. Together,
Yeah.
we can make that happen.
We have no choice.
We absolutely have to.
We have no choice.
Martin Luther King Jr. once said, hatred can't drive out hatred. Only light can do that.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Only love can do that. So let us love one another. Let us lean into challenging conversations and collectively build the society we want to see. Dia and Arnold, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Thank you. Thank you,
brother.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Take care.